In a world brimming with challenges and change, with crises all around us, we need ideas, innovation, and inspiration. Welcome to the Free Market Roadshow 2024, where the pulse of contemporary discussions beats.
Right, so as I mentioned to you guys, what we're going to do instead is rather than have a presentation and then a Q&A, what I encourage you guys to do is if there's any point where you have a question or disagreement or any thought that you want to share, feel free to raise your hand or just chime in. And I think what I'll do is maybe say another word or two about the speakers themselves. I know you probably read about them, but right at the far left, we have Eamonn Butler. Well, at that other end.
Well, now it's Sarah.
We have Eamonn Butler. Oh, great, Sarah's joining us. And as Sarah said, Eamonn founded the Adam Smith Institute, and the Adam Smith Institute is rated one of the leading think tanks in policy in the world. He also, in the 1970s, he worked on pensions and welfare issues in the US House of Representatives. He taught philosophy at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and then he returned to the UK to found the Adam Smith Institute, and he's also written many books, authored books about different economists and philosophers such as F.A. Hayek, Mises, Ayn Rand, etc. Then we have Barbara Kolm, and Barbara Kolm is not only the founder of the Free Market Roadshow, which is the series of events that you are currently attending. She's also the director of the Austrian Economic Center, which is an international think tank based in Vienna. She's the president of the Hayek Institute, which specializes in Hayekian economics to a German audience. She's professor of Austrian economics at the University of Donja, Gorica in Montenegro. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And she also serves on many different boards, including she served as the vice president of the Austrian National Bank. Then we have Richard Teather. Richard Teather is one of the leading British academic economists on the UK offshore tax. His book, The Benefits of Tax Competition, is held in government and university collections all over the world. And he's implemented many tax policy advice that has been followed successfully in many different jurisdictions. And finally, we have Pieter Cleppe, who's a policy analyst based in Brussels. He's editor-in-chief of the BrusselsReport.eu, which is an online magazine covering EU affairs. And he's also a research fellow at the US think tank Property Rights Alliance. He's been listed among ZN Consulting's top 40 EU influencers on Twitter. So, as I said, we have quite an accomplished set of speakers today. I think we'll get things started by having some opening remarks. Let's hear from our speakers on trade agreements. Let's hear about green economics, etc., geopolitics, and feel free to take this in any direction that you might find of interest. So why don't we start with you, Barbara?
Well, thank you very much for the intro. Welcome everybody, and I think we take it easy today. I assume many of you have heard about Hayek, F.A. von Hayek. So this year marks the 80th anniversary of his famous book, The Road to Success, and also the 50th anniversary.
Barbara, I'm just going to stop you. Have you heard of Hayek?
The ladies said yes.
Do you know who Hayek is? Or just heard of him? Barbara, do you want to introduce him?
On the spot there.
Sorry.
Okay, Hayek is the only Austrian economist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on how knowledge is being created in society, among many other things. But this was one of his key works, and he also coined the term methodological individualism, which means individuals think and act. Societies per se don't think and act, but it's the individual who creates something. It's not the government. So I'm talking about government. This book that I was mentioning was published in 1944 at the peak of war economy, when kind of big government or big state interventions, when governments were running the economy, not only in Great Britain, but also across Europe, whether it was Spain, whether it was Italy, or Germany, of course, but also in the communist parts in the Soviet Union. And so he was, and he published this book as a warning why government top-down planning, central planning does not work. And that we must not do that, but rather allow markets to be unleashed and to work freely and without interference. And of course, it was against totalitarianism of all kinds. This in a nutshell. And then he became famous because Reader's Digest picked up the idea in 1945 to publish it. And imagine there were 16 authors to read this thick volume of The Road to Serfdom and condensed it. So 16 different authors condensed it in the Reader's Digest version. Plus, you have to think Hayek, who back then was already living in Great Britain, was not as accomplished in English or as many of his academic colleagues. So it was a little bit of not clear and easy text to read. It was very complicated. So you have 16 different authors condensing this, and then in order to make it more sexy to the audience, they used cartoons. And the cartoons are still more than accurate if you look at what is happening around the world these days. So this was his famous warning in 1944. And then he was another point why he is so important to everybody of us who defends freedom, who loves freedom, because after all, this is the most important good that we need to defend. And most of the people only realize how important it is once it's lost, but then it's too late. So he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1974 for his work on and in his acceptance speech. By the way, he received the award with a social democrat, a socialist, Gunnar Myrdal from Sweden, who actually rather looked down at Hayek and did not was not happy about having to share this prize with somebody who is such a defender of markets. And Hayek, who was a very humble individual, just talked in his acceptance speech about the pretense of knowledge in society. And I can only tell you, have a look at this speech and you will realize how he ticks. And when we talk about this sustainable investing or climate policies with all regards, we also need to look into competition, and we also need to look into innovation. I came across a document today that I have with me to read, and this is an essay by Florian Heep from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and it's about sustainable investing and climate policies. It's complements, substitutes. And if we talk about this climate policy, Green Deal, and everything that is connected with that, we as Austrian economists, or at least I as an Austrian economist, am always very careful. And when we say, no top-down orders, those things can be solved bottom-up. Whether it's net zero or whether it's the Green Deal that the ECB is pushing. And I'm talking about the ECB. I don't think it's the task of the central bank, whether it's the European Central Bank or it's the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, to push for climate policies. It's not in their mandate. It's only in their mandate to keep price stability, fight inflation, and make sure that the financial markets are solid and sound. And in the US, also look at the labor market, take care of the labor markets. And yes.
Just two questions.
Yes.
I think the first one is, how do you feel about kind of removal of subsidies?
Sorry?
How do you feel about kind of removal of subsidies within the Green New Deal? So, for example, what was happening on the agricultural front, right, and then where we rolled it back because of protests and so on. That is, in a sense, kind of getting rid of market distorting subsidies that have so far been kind of pushed that way. And the second one is also, like, the Chinese central bank has at some point adjusted their mandate and kind of explicitly incorporated green bonds, kind of specific interest rates, favorable interest rates. They've been moving fairly quickly on some stuff. Should we be saying, oh, there is no mandate, hence we don't act? Or how do you feel about kind of maybe potentially adjusting the mandate? I think I probably also agree that the central bank should not be concerned if we don't give like fair interest rates to green bonds, but just out of interest.
Thank you very much for those questions. The first question I would say I'm not a fan of subsidies, not at all. And what the Commission has done on that front is definitely, I mean, if you look at the European budget, how much goes into agriculture, subsidies is ridiculous. It's almost 2/3, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, because you have those data much more accurate. But this is way too much, and subsidies have never helped. And talking about green technologies and green support, why do you think Germany is in such a bad shape these days? They moved from super cool car industry with combustion engines into e-cars just because they received, the big companies received a lot of subsidies for a short while. They changed technology, adapted their production lines, etc., etc. All of a sudden, they find out, you know, other producers can do it much cheaper and much better, like whether it's BYD or you name them across the world, and they are being outmaneuvered by competition, and so they are dead. And this was the same thing with the solar energy at the beginning when Merkel announced the change from nuclear to green, and when wind wheels and solar were subsidized, what happens again? Prices went up, and it didn't work out. It didn't work out for the Germans. Your second question, and then I would actually stop right away because I think this is already opening the discussion and we're not even in the topic. We've been working with the Chinese central bank, with the People's Bank of China, especially on CBDCs. So I was there seeing Governor Pan last year, and it's very interesting what they do on this front. But the question is, if what they do on this front, on CBDCs, is in their mandate or not, they can do whatever they want. And the same is true for green policies as well. And whether it's just, you know, labeling things by greenwashing is one thing, and doing real green policies is another thing. And I rather believe that you can do that bottom up, from small and medium-sized companies, from enterprises, from innovators that do this kind of policy, rather than ordered top-down by government, and especially not by a central bank. And the paper I was referring to, which was actually very interesting, was looking into green investment funds and looking who is invested in those funds, whether it's greenwash or greenwashing, or whether it's people who really want to make changes. And those who, it's just a short, in the summary it says, you know, those people who invest are, first of all, more educated and have a broader portfolio. They don't care if they lose, if they risk money right now. Their portfolio is broader. And if you have a very limited amount of money that you can put into the markets, then you'd rather not go into those green bonds. And this is just telling us that, you know, again, ordered from top down, it doesn't help. Those things have to emerge spontaneously, like our markets.
Interestingly on that, so just to jump in on the green investments thing, I did some research on this a while ago, almost all green investment funds are based in tax havens. Because you've got the lower regulation, you know, it's easier to actually set up something new in some of these places. So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, we can definitely go deeper into this direction if you guys are interested. But let's hear from the other speakers first and foremost. And just one note about Hayek. I mean, it's worthwhile reading The Road to Serfdom if you haven't. It's an interesting book. And another funny anecdote about him, he was acquainted with John Maynard Keynes, who studied here at Cambridge, and I think he taught here at Cambridge. And there's a story of Hayek and Keynes arguing about economics when Hayek visited Keynes here at Cambridge because there was a blitz in London. And there's these warplanes flying over them, and they're arguing about economics at one of the rooftops of the colleges here. So that's how committed they were to economics. And when someone's that committed to their field, it's probably worthwhile just hearing them out. Okay, well, why don't we move on now and hear from Eamonn Butler?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Congratulations to you, because you guys are obviously so far, so well organised and so far ahead with your revision that you can spare an afternoon before the exams. So I congratulate you on that. I've been asked to talk a little about trade and environmental and sustainability issues in international trade. And yes, indeed, there are indeed concerns about this. For example, there's the issue of transport emissions. If goods are transported over long periods, the argument is that this is not very good in terms of emissions. There are arguments about resource depletion, whether trade means that we're depleting particular areas of their resources, like fisheries or minerals, or forests being turned over to agriculture, and whether we're losing biodiversity. And there are arguments about are we just simply creating pollution havens where we buy it, we don't produce things ourselves, but we buy it from China, and they're building new power stations, every day, fueled by coal. So they're just we're just shifting the problem to somewhere else on the planet. On the other hand, of course, there are many environmental benefits from trade which are often overlooked. You have this specialization in trade that countries and industries do what they're best at. As Adam Smith many years ago said, you can grow grapes in Scotland and make good wine out of it, but it's very much more expensive to do that than it is to import grapes from France. And in this country, something like 70% of the flowers that we buy, when it's your granny's birthday and you buy a bunch of flowers, the chances are they come from Kenya. And you think, is that the right thing to do? But, look at it this way. We're using Kenyan solar energy to produce flowers. It's much more efficient than trying to do it ourselves in greenhouses and things like that. So specialization can actually lead to more optimum resource use. Trade also means that you're not only exporting goods and services, but you're exporting technology as well. And so if you have advanced, environmentally friendly technology in one country, it can be quickly transported, if you like, to other ones. And because trade specialization means that people are working on a larger scale, you can afford to put that technology in, which you might not do if you're just dealing with like small farms, for example. And there's another argument which I would mention, which is the income argument, that trade makes people rich, particularly it makes the poorest rich. We've almost eliminated dollar-a-day poverty from the planet, basically in the last 30 years, because that's when we've opened up trade. And wealthier people want a cleaner environment. If you go to poorer countries, they're filthy. Richer countries are clean, because in poorer countries the priority is to put food on the table and get some healthcare and things like that, not to have a tidy environment. Whereas if you can afford it, then you're very much more interested in cleaning up the environment. So I think there's, in other words, objections to all of the common worries about trade on the emissions front. I think about transport. I mean, these container ships, for example, that send goods and services, goods around the planet, are so enormous that actually the environmental impact is very minor. that people complain about food miles, but most food miles are the last mile from the supermarket to your house, not bringing stuff in from Jamaica or wherever. And on the resource depletion thing, I think that this is what Tim Westall calls the no breakfast fallacy. You look in the fridge in the evening and you say, oh, we haven't got anything for breakfast, we're going to starve. But what you do then is you go to the supermarket, you buy something for breakfast, and put that in the fridge. And it's exactly the same with resources. People say, oh, we're running out of magnesium or copper or whatever. It's simply because it's not worth at the moment exploring new sources of this. Things like oil is worth exploring, and that's why we've had things like the North Sea. Very expensive to get oil out of the North Sea, but it's worth doing because it's such a valuable commodity. So I think that is the answer to that, and I think also that one of the problems is that it's not a case that we've got too much market economy, it's that we've got too little, that if we actually applied the price mechanism to things and actually applied property rights to things, like clean air, then we would get cleaner air and cleaner water and all the rest of it. It's a property rights problem. As to how we move forward and promote sustainability in trade, it seems to me that if carbon is the problem, I'm not sure, but if carbon is the problem, put a tax on it, and then people will use less of it. And we can all put our feet up, and the market will take care of it. I think that that's much better than having fiddly little subsidies and controls and all the rest of it, which are really driven by political agendas. If carbon is the problem, tax it, and that's the end of the problem. So I think trade agreements already have a lot of environmental clauses in them and voluntary arrangements for improving the environment. I think another thing that we need to do is to have actually more private investment in infrastructure. At the moment, things like ports and harbours are largely run by government organisations, and they're really very inefficient for the most part. I think if we had more private investment in these things, there would be much more energy efficiency, and I think that we would have much more technology transfer between different industries and indeed different countries. So I think the markets are the solution here, not the problem.
Thank you, Eamonn. I think, okay, if you have questions, we can open it up now. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here because of you today. I'll read your newsletter, and that's what it's the thing. I want to take issue with a couple of things you said. I actually agree with most of it, but pandering to governments by talking about carbon is just wrong. It's not carbon anyway, it's carbon dioxide, yes. And it's nonsense. And inviting them to taxes is just nigh on national suicide. So, please don't pander to them doing stuff like that. Taxing carbon dioxide when it's free and available in the air is a ludicrous concept. I want to just pick a small bone with you about the example you used about the flowers, though. If you think about it, they're a luxury good. Nobody needs flowers. And I don't know this as a fact, but I bet if you looked, some ridiculous proportion of that is sold through our supermarkets. It's an oligopoly. It ought not to be. It screws up trade. It screws up all sorts of things in this country. And the fact that they're buying flowers from Kenya is probably part of that whole ridiculous oligopoly. They can't beat up UK growers so much as they can beat up Kenyan growers, so they do. And that's not something to be applauded. I'm completely with you on your other thoughts there.
Well, you speak to all my prejudices, I have to say, and I do tend to agree that, yes, I'm by no means convinced that carbon dioxide is the problem. It seems to be that it's become seen as the only problem. And I'm not sure. There's lots of other things going on, and the climate does change, and it's rather presumptive of us to assume that the environment as it is today is the right one. It's never been like it is today in history, and it won't be in the future. So, why are we obsessed with not making it any cooler and not making it any warmer and so on? And why do we think that it is simply that cause when climate has changed for different causes? So that's that one. On flowers, yes, of course, there is a lot of oligopoly in markets and so on. But I'm sort of making the point that, as I say, we can use Kenyan solar power if we like. I mean, it makes a lot more sense to produce a number of goods and indeed services in some countries than others. That goes back to Ricardo and comparative advantage. So we ought to be grasping that because that reduces costs all around. It makes us wealthier, and if we get wealthier, then we can do something about environmental issues much more easily than we could do if we were poor. So it makes us more conscious of that as well. So I think that this reinforces the argument. Yeah.
Very good point about the tax. I'm 100% with you on that. You have a question there?
I take loads of issues with kind of having to tax carbon. The students know environmental externality problems and so on. We know climate change is happening. We know it's real. There's no denying it and so on. I'm not going to go into all that because I'm also leaving in 5 minutes anyways. I want to ask kind of a more contentful question that I came across at the start. Because you talk about kind of trade and knocking down barriers and so on. I wonder how you feel about kind of the recent 2-3 days ago, Biden imposes some kind of tariffs on lots of particularly kind of green products, right? Partially from China. At the same time, you get the oversupply argument from China because people say, hey, there's kind of excess capacity, we're oversupplying. China's producing 800 gigawatts worth of kind of solar wind PV material, kind of potentially subsidized to a lower cost as well. Lots of it being produced in Xinjiang. But at the same time, you want to leverage kind of gains from cost downs, gains from kind of, knowledge and learning and so on. Is there a fair level of kind of supply chain independence? Should it be 100%? Should it be 30%? Or do you feel like maybe Chinese FDI into Hungary would be kind of the right, they're investing in it, battery factories there. There is probably still not a black and white argument between saying, oh, all trade, no barriers, no tariffs, because certain places have their own subsidies in place and so on. But, when I talk to people, they're more debating what level of supply chain independence is fair, where are we hoaxing about kind of national security concerns, and where are they very fair? Should we be doing batteries more, kind of a more nuanced view within that? What level is fair, and how do you view kind of subsidies in specific places then interacting with international trade?
Milton Friedman always used to say that, well, if a country is subsidizing its goods and selling to them cheaply, you should buy them, because then you get the goods cheaper. And at some point, the local citizens in that country are going to object to paying all these subsidies so that rich Westerners can buy their goods cheaply.
You get stranded asset problems, you get local employment problems. It's again, I'm not saying 100. I'm not terrified. We should definitely in order to enable the renewable transition, focus heavily on it. But I see arguments for a certain I've spoken to Chinese envoys and so on as well. They're oh, we understand that Europe or the US will want to build partially owned supply chains. And maybe we as kind of representatives care more about getting more accepting of Chinese FDI into, for example, Germany or Hungary in order to foster local jobs, not cause political backlash, thereby again dampening the transition. So you get all these kind of feedback arguments for saying, okay, let's not just do it 100%.
It's a messy world. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And these sorts of things do go on a very grand scale. And I think one of the most common features of human psychology is protectionism and trying to keep out other people. And I think the trouble is when you do start to interfere in trade relationships like that, and you say, like the EU is saying, well, we're going to have tariffs on certain countries because we don't think that their production is very green. Well, then you've introduced something that can be used by manufacturers in your own country as a weapon to keep out other countries, and yes, other countries, and other countries. So, once you've got the power there, people are going to abuse it. And that is, I think, the difficulty with these things. So my prejudice is always in favour of free trade. I think, yes, there are a number of cases where, for example, countries use trade as a tool of foreign policy, as a political weapon, rather than to benefit their own citizens through trade. So that is a problem, and you have to respond to it. But again, as Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, that you've got to realise that if you do try to retaliate against these things, then if you don't watch it, you're going to be in an endless spiral.
Again, I slightly disagree. I spoke to like Nigel Topping, Adair Turner, Todd Stern, like all the people that kind of do lots of international, those kinds of dialogues, also dialogues to China, go to COPs and so on. They're saying the narrative around CBAM is kind of shifting, where at the start, of course, there's some kind of caution, similar to like an IRA, right? When you allow drilling in the North Sea, that's what messes you up on an international scale. That's when people point at you and say, why the hell should we be transitioning if you're exploring oil in the North Sea? If you do something like CBAM and you say, hey, this is an opportunity to introduce similar kind of standards, taxation, etc., to deal with externality problems in your own country, and thereby not like for us to do protectionism, it's kind of more to like get people. People are getting on board with it. Like I've heard lots of, Ruto at the last COP saying, oh, hey, we can see, yes, that's like an opportunity for us to do it now. Kind of like Chinese producers saying, hey, we want a stronger carbon market, we actually want similar kind of taxonomies for green bonds, we want to be more integrated to those things. The UK is like desperately trying to get back into CBAM. Like I don't think the international community is like backlashing against it. I think there's like a general view that this is something that helps us get there. Like I have not heard very negative opinions on CBAM recently from like people that do international negotiation for like the West. On a daily basis.
I'm hearing a lot from businesses, a lot of negativity about it.
Businesses where, like in the EU, or like internationally?
UK and internationally mostly, yeah. The EU ones generally like it because they're seeing it as an extra wall around Fortress Europe. It's another protectionist thing, protecting businesses within Europe. The huge problem with these things is, which is what I was going to talk about in a minute, but we might as well start now since you brought it up, is green taxes are theoretically sound good, and CBAM is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is saying that if you buy something or other made in Europe, then it's going to have energy taxes built into it because the producers have been charged them. If it's built in China, it doesn't have those. So what we'll do is tax that embedded energy production as it comes into the country. It's the huge problem with it is getting the rate right.
Yeah.
And there's already big arguments about what the correct price to put on carbon dioxide is, what the correct price on emissions is, and once you ally that with the fact that it has a differential effect on businesses, so some are benefiting from it, others are being hurt by it. You start getting lobbying, and the whole thing turns into a huge political mess. And this is the big problem with it. The green taxes were a huge thing about 10 years ago. I had almost all of my students who were doing dissertations on green taxes and how to do that, and all sorts of brilliant ideas coming up about how we can actually measure this and things. But actually, what it's all founded on is that difficulty of setting a correct price, measuring what's gone into it, and actually getting it right. And once you lose that, then, as I said, the potential for lobbying for business organisations trying to say, either we want an exemption for us or we want something higher because that'll kill off our competitors or whatever. And the whole thing just becomes some sort of Trumpian Little England and Fortress Europe nightmare with, the protectionists jump on the back of this as a bandwagon and are using this as the way to get their protectionist policies through under this sort of green canopy.
One project I work with is with Rod Richardson, which is basically an American foundation, and they actually try to promote an alternative to the more punitive climate policy model, so an alternative to taxes, restrictions, whatnot.
Whitelisting.
So their idea, for what it's worth, is basically that you abolish the Paris Treaty and that you have a new treaty framework with signatories, being able to profit from like lower taxes than countries that are not signatory. And the idea is to be as technologically neutral as possible. It's never going to be perfect because at the end of the day you still profit from lower taxes, except that you don't increase them for the polluters, you decrease them for the non-polluters. So that's the approach. And the expectation is that then climate neutral technologies like nuclear power, if indeed, of course, the excessive health and safety culture is scrapped, would prevail. I mean, that's a theory. I guess, like always, it won't be perfect, but I think it's an interesting approach.
I think it's good to say, hey, we subsidizing on some ends. I think it's good to say we might whitelist some goods so that they're protected of tariffs and so on. I don't think Paris in itself is punitive by nature, right? You can very much stay within Paris and do those policies. I don't think there's a necessity to say we're doing away with carbon reporting and transparency and regular updating of NDCs, which is all that's ingrained in Paris.
Okay.
Paris doesn't say you need to tax. Paris doesn't say you need to do this.
Maybe
Paris
more
just
than
says, hey, we want to reduce carbon dioxide because we know it's the cause of
maybe the current complex. You could say like the ETS cap and trade in the EU. That would have to go.
Paris is just transparency and shared but differentiated responsibility. That's all that Paris is. It doesn't say anything.
Sure. Then that can stay.
Exactly. But I think fully I agree that it's completely a positive incentive framing. That's probably
a simple approach.
I think what you said earlier, which was not on the point, but on the general discussion, is a really important point. Where you said some of the frameworks between the speakers and yourselves are quite far apart, and you don't think that and that's fine, because we're not here to find that alignment, and we're not here to change minds, but we're here to have a healthy discussion, and that's exactly what we're doing. And I think what I'd like to do now, just so we stay on topic and don't kind of diverge, Richard, why don't you say a few words before we move on?
Yes, thank you. Yes. So just a quick mention, since you talked about Hayek and Keynes. There's
getting this name?
I'm in Cambridge, yeah, it's the wrong place. There's not only, as Barbara said, a brilliant cartoon version of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, there's also a rap battle video between Keynes and Hayek, which is well worth reading. If you ever think economics is boring, it's on YouTube, have a look at this, absolutely great. Obviously done, a modern one done by actors, they didn't actually manage to get Hayek in. Yeah, as I say, my thing is tax, so obviously I do it, green taxes have been a big part of that. I've just actually done a lot of what I was going to say as a response to the question there, but just to fill in, green taxes, the starting point is they're probably better than government regulation. Because, as Eamonn said earlier, you set a price and then you leave people to deal with that in the best way. Rather than having governments mandating how you're going to deal with it. Most of you probably weren't worrying too much about buying light bulbs 15 years ago, but there was a good example of this, that the government was trying to push these compact fluorescent bulbs, which were basically a fluorescent light strip, twisted up to fit into a light fitting. Absolutely dreadful things. They were the light they gave off was awful. They gave people migraines. They didn't actually give very much reduction in the energy use. It was only about 15%. And worst of all, they contained mercury, which was fine when they were used for specialist industrial things. But once you start trying to get everyone in all households using them, these things just get dumped into landfill rather than, they were supposed to be processed properly. It's going to be one of the next environmental scandals in 50 years' time, I think, when all these light bulbs start leaching mercury down into the water sources from the landfill site. But government was trying to push these at a time when actually the people working in the industry knew that the LED bulbs were only about 2 years off the supermarket shelves. So if they just set a price on energy consumption, and then left people to sort out how to do it, actually the answer probably was ignore those things. It's a technological dead end. Let's just use slightly more efficient ones, or the old-fashioned ones, until the new LED bulbs come in, and then we can sort it out, which would have probably been most people's solution and the market solution, the right one. So, but because government was trying to mandate a solution rather than just put a price on the problem, we ended up going down, and of course then there was lobbying from the people producing these things as well, so get governments to back them. So the government mandation thing caused a lot of problems. Unfortunately, green taxes aren't an ideal solution either, as we've seen. There's a lot of problems there. There's a lot of lobbying, as I said, for exemptions, but also lobbying for the taxes as well, because a lot of businesses, particularly big businesses, see tax as quite useful, because what it does is kills off their smaller competitors, because it makes it more difficult to get into the business. And especially once you've got into things like, as I said, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, you've got inside versus outside, and your local domestic producers are lobbying for this carbon border tax because it's helping shut out foreign competition. So that's one big problem with it. Another is it just becomes a source of revenue and control. Do we trust politicians with, you give politicians more money, it's like giving a toddler a box of matches. And matches can be useful, they can be essential, but you've got to have somebody responsible in charge of them. And the more I see of politicians, what they do, and you meet them, and most of them aren't very bright, and the ones that are scheming weasels. But there's, you get a problem that you're actually funding more. You're providing an easy thing for governments, and that's self-serving politicians like that, civil servants like that, because running the government efficiently and effectively is actually hard work and boring. So it's much easier just to whack up taxes. And the big thing about carbon taxes is, of course, they've got people lobbying for more taxes. So this is like giving crack cocaine to, this is giving government, you're actually begging the government to tax you more. So of course they like them, of course it's popular with them. The result of this is that we end up with taxes too high, and green taxes in the UK, eco taxes, are too high. This isn't just me saying, yeah, I think they're too high, I think they should be lower. This is actually looking at the numbers. Yeah. If you take the total UK carbon emissions, and yeah, there's differences as to whether it's domestic production or domestic consumption and all that stuff, but if you take any figure you like for total UK carbon emissions, multiply that by the cost of carbon, and again, there's different cost of carbons, but if you look at the Stern Review and the social cost of carbon, where he's saying this is the level at which we can either mitigate it or compensate. So if you set this price, we don't care whether you produce more or less, because if you produce more, we've got the money to do something about it. If you produce less, then yeah, fine. Then if you put those two together, and adding on inflation for Stern, you come up to UK carbon taxes should be about £17.5 billion a year, somewhere between 15 and 20. UK green taxes at the moment are 55 billion a year, so roughly 3 times what they should be. And yes, you can fiddle about with the definitions, and you can argue about what the carbon price should be and how much emissions we're actually generating if you include Chinese production that comes into the UK and so on. But all of these, actually, whichever way you cut it, the current taxes are too high, based not on other problems and things that it's causing, but actually just based on what are we trying to do with this. We're trying to price in the externality of carbon, we're overdoing it. And therefore we're shutting off people being able to do things, businesses being able to do things, people being able to enjoy themselves, get the things that they want, live the standard of living that they want, because we're actually overcharging, we're overcompensating for this, and that's as big a problem as undercompensating. how do we get this? Well, you know, you then end up, as I said, with all this problem with the, you know, the anti-free market, anti-globalization, the sort of nationalistic Trump, Little Englander thing, using this as an excuse, as a green cover to try and say we need to shut out all these foreign markets. And, you know, this has been a long-running thing. One of my favourite historical MPs, not because I like him, but because he was so awful that he's quite fascinating, was Colonel Sibthorpe, who was an MP for Lincoln in the late 19th century. This was the man who objected to the Great Exhibition in London because it was done by Prince Albert, who was German. You know, he came up with this thing that in opposition to foreign imports because they're made by people who live on a bowl of rice a day. You know, and it's that same sort of attitude is coming in now with the green taxes, that we're saying, you know, oh, these people just aren't doing things the right way. We need to make them do them the Western way, and so on. And there's a lot of, yeah, there's some genuine reasons for having green taxes, but there's also a lot of really bad stuff that's actually using this as an excuse to put forward a nationalistic, protectionist agenda on that. So why do we end up with them? As I say, self-serving politicians, lazy civil servants, a lot of business lobbying and trying to do down their competitors. Frankly, a lot of status signalling as well, particularly from sort of people my age and above, that, you know, a lot of these things, they increase the costs and the hassle of things. So by lobbying for green taxes, you're saying, oh, well, I've got enough money to pay even, you know. And, you know, isn't it a hassle sorting out your recycling? Well, no, the OPER does that, darling. You know, there's a lot of that sort of attitude coming in as well. But one thing I think that's behind a lot of it as well, and this is one of the big dangers, is it's really playing to one of these big divisions in society, not just English society, but it comes up everywhere. But I call it the Cavaliers versus Puritan issue, because this is, you know, what came out of this English Civil War was this basic dichotomy between two groups of people, which I think is not just an English thing, I think it's a generic thing that comes across everywhere. That it's two approaches to life. Is your approach to life that people should be able to pursue their own idea of what a good life is and find their own way of doing this? And yes, as long as you don't sort of actively harm other people, then you should be able to do your own thing. You know, other different people have different ideas, genuinely legitimate, different ideas of what a good life is and how to get there. And we should let people follow these and do and pursue those goals. And on the other hand, you've got the Puritan attitude that, you know, I have a secret idea of, you know, secret knowledge of the good way to live. And this is the right way to live, and therefore everyone ought to live this way, and trying to impose it on everybody. And there's a lot of that in the Green movement as well, I find, that a lot of it is saying, well, you shouldn't be going on a foreign holiday every year, because that's not the way to do things. So whatever, you know, don't fly, yeah. There's a lot of this sort of idea that I know the right way to live, and therefore everyone else should follow this as well. And that's really worrying. But, you know, so if we're in yes, there's a lot of issues on green tax. I can see the legitimate argument for it. There's a lot of difficulties in getting it right, and a lot of these things are not things that we can solve. They're actually problems embedded in the system, which make it politically or economically impossible to actually get it right. But also, you know, if it's coming down to a fight between Cavaliers and Puritans, then, you know, get me a floppy hat with a big feather, because I'm on the Cavalier side of this argument.
It's indulgence.
Thank you. So I've prepared something on politicizing trade. So, I mean, trade is not entirely free, to put it mildly. There's lots of restrictions, bilateral trade deals, multilateral trade deals, standards, whatnot. And obviously, you know, it's not black and white, but the goal should be to make it as free as possible. So as I mentioned, I'm based in Brussels. I follow up whatever the European Union is doing, also when it comes to opening up trade. So for the 27 countries that are still a member of the EU, no longer the UK, the European Commission has the monopoly to negotiate trade deals. Once Trump proposed to the German Chancellor to have a trade deal, but she had to inform him that he had to go to Brussels because Brussels is going over this. And to be fair, despite all the the downsides of the EU in terms of coming up with too many regulations and being often too protectionist, I think over the years, at least until Brexit, the EU had quite a bit of success with concluding trade deals. Since Brexit, and certainly since Ms. von der Leyen, the current Commission President, is in charge, there's less success. The European Union really seems to be struggling to open up trade barriers, to conclude trade deals with other countries, even if post-Brexit Britain hasn't done all that much, unfortunately, either. Now, a good example is the Mercosur trade deal. I don't know if you follow this. This is the trade bloc composed of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. They had more or less a deal in principle with the EU, and then what happened is the European Union reopened the negotiations. They said, well, actually, we also want you to introduce and then followed a list of all kinds of environmental regulations, which of course was quite surprising for the Latin American trade partner, because they were thinking, well, we were hoping to trade, not to receive a list with instructions on regulations, what to introduce into our democracies. And as a result of that, also partly because of French protectionism, there's still no deal when it comes to this relatively important trade deal. A second example is the so-called due diligence regulation that has just been introduced in Brussels. So this basically is not imposing things on trading partners, but it is imposing all kinds of obligations on European businesses, only big businesses, that are active in this trading partners. Both regulation when it comes to social and environmental goals on the one hand, and forced labor on the other. Now, I think when you're talking about forced labor, in China, according to some estimates, there's 2 million people in concentration camps, really. The Uyghurs, mainly, re-education camps. It's clear that it cannot be seen as fair that a company can produce and have an advantage because of that. So I'm quite open to action here. The question is, how do you do it? The United States has basically banned trade from 2 Chinese provinces. That's one approach. Probably not going to change much, to be honest. Then the EU is trying with this due diligence approach, basically telling companies to try to find if there is forced labor in their supply chain. But of course, as you can imagine, these companies are more than capable, the local companies, to try to circumvent it. So I'm afraid the sad truth is it's very difficult to do anything about it. That said, I'm open to imposing some kind of forced labor due diligence regulations. However, when you're talking about imposing social and environmental policy choices, this is of course a lot more open to debate what is good, what is bad. Sometimes it's better for countries that they for a period have, let's say, not overly strict regulations, because at the end this will help them to trade more, and ultimately the actual social and environmental standards will increase. At least that's what we've seen most of the times in the past, so it would be strange that we don't see it. However, the European Union disagrees with that. They say, no, we have to basically harass our own companies with all of this, which will of course then also disadvantage them in the competition. Now, a very important topic of contention when you're talking about politicized trade is also the Deforestation Directive, which is not only about deforestation. This is about, as the word suggests, European regulation imposing on importers to follow certain standards when it comes to avoiding excessive deforestation and to protect the environment. Now, what's the problem? It's mostly Malaysia and Indonesia that are angry about this, because they export a lot of palm oil to Europe, and as opposed to producers like Brazil, where the deforestation problem has worsened, In these countries, according to the relatively independent NGOs, the Global Forest Watch NGO, for example, they have made massive progress when it comes to deforestation, basically by working through certification, asking that companies that do that are certified, and around 98% is certified. Now, the EU, they are not interested in that. They say, no, we don't want to recognize your certification. You have to, and all these NGOs, SMEs over there, small companies over there, they have to go through a whole range of new bureaucracy. As a result of this has led to last year a big trading dispute between Southeast Asia and the European Union. And Southeast Asia is very important because, let's say, we have less and less trade between Europe and China, so this is sort of the new market, also in other respects a growth market. It's not just about deforestation, because the United Kingdom actually did something absolutely very right, I think, on that topic. It decided to recognize the local certification that you have when it comes to this specific industry. And this enabled the UK to get Malaysia behind the UK to join the CPTPP, which is the big trade deal that Trump had once put on frozen, and in the end had continued without the United States. So we have to go back for that a few years when I think it was still Obama. He tried to have a big trade deal between the US and European nations on the one hand, and then another big trade deal between the US and Pacific nations to sort of encircle China. And it's not always with the best intentions of free trade, but it would do that. It would be more protectionist versus China, but it would be good in the sense that it would be opening up more among the partners. Now Trump pulled out, TTIP, so the European-US thing collapsed. It actually already collapsed before Trump because the Europeans didn't really want it. But thankfully the Pacific trade deal continued, and Brexit Britain has succeeded in getting access to this, which is great. It's about 15% of GDP, this trade deal, so it's the greatest success that the UK has had in terms of trade since it acquired its own trading powers. And as I mentioned, it's also thanks to leniency, flexibility from the UK side when it comes to recognizing the standards of others, because ultimately this is really what trade is about. It's not about sending a list with regulations to a trading partner. It's about trusting each other also within the European Union. Ultimately, this is really what trade is about, and what is less and less understood, I would say, by EU policymakers. However, there is some change coming up. When it comes, especially the CBAM, initiative, which was mentioned earlier, which is a tariff, climate tariff, and basically the EU saying, oh, it's so unfair that the rest of the world is not copy-pasting our own climate policies. To do something about it, we will impose a tariff on steel imports from Africa, from India, and to basically teach them a lesson until they copy or wise climate policies. The emerging world are not so enthusiastic about this. India, South Africa, Taiwan are considering to legally challenge CBAM at the WTO. There's estimates actually from the London School of Economics that African economies would be burdened by 25 billion a year, around 1% reduction of GDP as a result of this protectionist CBAM tariff. So this is a vital thing, I think, especially as I mentioned before, that there are other methods to try to promote climate policy, not by the stick but by the carrot, by saying, look, if you book success when it comes to CO2 reduction, then you're welcome into our free trade club. which is a good idea anyway, right? Even if you're, let's say, not 100% convinced by the CO2 thing. So I think that's something that should be able to bring everybody together, but unfortunately that's certainly not what European policymakers are pursuing. They continue to go further and further, and when climate policy was mostly affecting domestic economic policies, now it has affected trade. There I conclude, the good thing is that at the highest level of the European Commission they are finally seeming to get it. And Sabine Weyand, she is the top European Commission trade official, she said last month that she got all kinds of questions at the WTO from the trading partners who asked her who has appointed you, the European Union, world regulator, question mark, which is a pertinent question to ask. It's one thing to be an important market, it's another to try to use every single occasion to open up trade to impose all kinds of preferred policies. Also in DG internal partnerships, they are working on this in the European Commission. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's let's hope that the lack of success that the European Union has had in the last 5 years when it comes to trade makes it reflect that it has to perhaps take an example to Brexit Britain by recognizing the standards of trading partners.
Thank you, Peter. But I think something that Peter said is just something I want to leave you with, because this has been something that's been, there's a principle that has been implicit in everything that has been said today, but no one's really made it explicit. We're all talking about this would be better, this would be worse, we should make this freer, we should reduce the amount of regulations. And Peter said, well, there's a deeper conversation to be had about what is good and what is bad. And there's been an implicit standard of value in everything that has been said here, including some of the questions that we've had. And I think you can ask about flowers and forests if that's what you're interested in, but if you're interested in addressing some of the deeper issues, as in, well, why is freedom good? Or is it good, and is it even good in itself? What is good?
Use this experience to fuel your aspirations. Be part of the change. Let's explore, learn, and grow together. Secure your spot now.